talk about a myth that just won't die. The myth that metal production peaked in the 2000s. You know the sound I'm talking about. That razor-sharp, aggressive, super tight production from bands like Killswitch Engage, Lamb of God, I'll take you to the truth for the Trivium, System of a Down, wake up! And a bunch of others. It was definitely a game-changing decade, but lots of people look back on it like it was some sort of a golden age. But was it? For those who don't know me, I'm Eyal Levi, CEO of URM Academy. I've been a producer and guitarist in my band Doth since 1999, so I was right in the thick of this whole transition. I lived it, and I'm here to tell you the 2000s was not the peak for metal production. Far from it. A lot of those records were sonically flawed, crushed by the loudness wars, and full of early digital artifacts that make me cringe now. But here's the thing. While it might not have been the best sounding era, in my opinion, it was the most important. It was a decade of transition. The music industry as we knew it collapsed. The digital revolution hit fucking hard. And out of all that chaos came the tools and techniques that still define metal production to this day. So let's break it down. To understand the 2000s, you have to remember what a perfect storm it was. In the 90s, CDs were booming, but by 2000, the bubble popped. Why? You know why. Because of peer-to-peer file sharing networks like Napster and Kazaa. Between the year 2000 and 2011, CD sales in the US dropped from over 940 million to just 240 million. Think about that. The labels were bleeding money. That led to mass layoffs, and most critically for us, recording budgets vanished into thin air. At the same time, recording technology was flipped upside down. Big analog studios with million-dollar consoles were on their way out. Digital audio workstations, or DAWs, were in. Now don't get me wrong, this shift had a massive upside. The democratization of production. For the first time in history, you could make a pro record in your bedroom for a few $1,000s. Pro Tools became the standard. Suddenly you had infinite tracks, or close to infinite, non-destructive editing, the ability to comp takes with surgical precision, and believe me, we used the hell out of it. The DAW's visual grid completely redefined musical time. In the analog world, timing was all about feel. With the grid, timing became absolute mathematical precision. It was like going from driving by instinct to having a GPS tell you exactly where the beat is. This was an incredible tool for making complex arrangements locked together with insane tightness, but it also tempted us to quantize everything, to snap every single note to the grid. The pursuit of rhythmic perfection is a huge part of the 2000s sound, but it's also why so many records from that era sound sterile and robotic. But with all this new power, there were some huge unforeseen circumstances.
Get on the ground.
Get on the ground.
Get on the ground.
With great power comes great responsibility.
For decades, you learned by assisting in big studios, setting up mics, making coffee, and soaking up wisdom. When those studios died, that system died too. Suddenly, you had this new generation of mouse wizards that slayed it with Pro Tools and digital editing, but they might have lacked the foundational knowledge of acoustics, microphone theory, and signal flow that was once passed down. Honestly, this is one of the biggest reasons for why I started URM Academy. I wanted to create a new kind of mentorship system for the digital age, a place where all that critical knowledge wouldn't be lost. And speaking of recording, this video is brought to you by Nail the Mix. If you want to learn how to mix and master metal, Nail the Mix is the place to do it straight from the best. Mixers like Will Putney, Buster Odeholm, Jens Bogren, Nolly, TLA, David Bendeth, and artists such as Gojira, Meshuggah, Periphery, Opeth, Nickelback, and over 100 more. At the start of the month, we released the raw multi-tracks from the session so you can download them straight into your DAW and mix the song from scratch. Getting your hands on this kind of source material is an incredible learning opportunity, just so you can see what the standard really is like at this level. Then, at the end of the month, the mixer does a live stream where they break down exactly how they mixed it on the record and answers your questions live. You can also join our monthly mixing competition. Submit your mix, vote for your favorites, and win prizes like microphones, guitars, plugins, gear, and a lot more cool stuff. And your membership comes packed with extras. All the URM plugins, MixLab with over 150 tutorials, Riff Hard for guitarists, and access to our private community on Discord and Facebook. So if you're serious about leveling up your mixes and learning from the very best, check out nailthemix.com today. It's at the link in the description of this video. Now, as groundbreaking as the tools from that era were, they weren't quite there yet. We were in a sonic uncanny valley. The tech was good enough to approximate real instruments, but not good enough to really feel human. Take guitar tones. The Line 6 Pod was a game changer, but those early digital models were often thin and stiff. They captured a static snapshot of tone, but couldn't replicate the dynamic response of a real amp. The Pod wasn't alone. Early versions of Amplitude, Guitar Rig, and a few other sims were starting to pop up. You could get away with a clean tone or sometimes a lead tone if you worked really hard at it, and sometimes you'd even stumble across a rhythm tone that sat okay in the mix, but for the most part, those tools just weren't there yet. They lacked the punch, depth, and feel of a real amp and cab. That's why so many of us used them as placeholders for scratch tracks and demos, but then we would reamp through real amps and heads when it came to make the record. Going fully in the box for guitars was almost unthinkable. It wasn't until later with Kemper, Axe effects, and impulse responses that digital tones finally started to compete with and sometimes even surpass the real thing. And it was the same story with drums. Software like Drumagog made sample replacement easy, and it became a signature part of the sound. The libraries back then were limited. No deep velocity layers, no round robins. That's why you got the dreaded machine gun effect, where every snare hit sounded identical and drilled into your brain. Toontrack's Drum Kit from Hell came out in 1999 and was groundbreaking. BFD followed in 2003 with one of the first truly realistic multi-gigabyte kits. And then, in 2004, DFH Superior expanded the possibilities with bigger, more detailed libraries. Then, in 2008, Superior Drummer 2 set a new benchmark for realism and flexibility, and it quickly became a studio staple. By the end of the decade, Steven Slate's sample packs were starting to spread, and that laid the groundwork for Trigger and the more advanced drum replacement workflows that would define the 2010s. But the single ugliest, most destructive trend of the entire decade was the loudness war. The philosophy was simple: louder is better, and to be fair, our brains do perceive it that way. Louder mixes do usually feel more powerful and exciting. The problem was that we hadn't yet figured out how to make things loud properly. We waged this war with new digital tools called brickwall limiters, crushing the dynamic range of our tracks until the waveforms looked like literal bricks. The result wasn't just loud, it was distorted, flat, and exhausting to listen to. The poster child for this whole mess was Metallica's 2008 album Death Magnetic. It was so hyper compressed that it was audibly clipping. It was a total disaster, and the crazy thing is, the version of the album in the Guitar Hero video game didn't have this final limiting, and it sounded way better quieter, but clearer and more dynamic. That led to a fan revolt with over 20,000 people signing a petition demanding the album be remastered. Death Magnetic was a perfect case study of applying an analog, push it into the red mentality to a digital medium that's completely unforgiving. Digital clipping is not warm saturation. It's harsh, ugly, and it means that your data is gone forever. Of course, these new tools and trends didn't exist in a vacuum. They were used to forge the distinct sonic identities of the decade's biggest subgenres. Nu metal fully embraced the new digital paradigm, with Linkin Park's Hybrid Theory being a perfect example of that. The record blended traditional tracking with meticulous Pro Tools editing and layering. Its sound came from really thick guitars, processed drums, and the seamless interplay of Chester's vocals and Mike's raps, all tightly polished in the DAW. It was not just a rock record, it was engineered from the ground up to dominate radio and MTV. But while nu metal was ruling the mainstream, metalcore was blowing up the underground. One of the key records was Killswitch Engage's Alive or Just Breathing in 2002. It fused American hardcore aggression with the harmonized guitar melodies of Swedish death metal, bands like At the Gates and In Flames. It was produced by Adam D and mixed by Andy Sneap, and it nailed the balance between thrash riffs, hardcore chugs, and huge anthemic choruses. Just as important, Sneap's punchy, sample-reinforced snare became the sound everyone tried to copy. That mix of aggression, melody, and polished power became the blueprint for 2000s metalcore. And of course, you can't talk about the chaos of the 2000s without bringing up Slipknot. Their 2001 album Iowa is a benchmark for what a raw, aggressive record should sound like. It was produced by Ross Robinson, and the sessions were notoriously dark. Lots of internal strife in the band, addiction problems, and you can hear that genuine chaos in the final product. It's unhinged sounding. It's probably one of the rawest major label releases ever made. But just a few years later, for Volume 3, they enlisted Rick Rubin and made a record with more melody and even acoustic instruments. The fact that one band could have two such wildly different sounding records back to back showed just how much the production landscape was shifting. And then in 2008, Colin Richardson mixed All Hope Is Gone, which stands as a benchmark for the polished modern metal sound. It was tight, powerful, and aggressive, but with the clarity and sheen that defined the late 2000s. The limitless possibilities of the DAW also allowed for insane ambition. This is where things get crazy. In Norway, Dimmu Borgir dragged symphonic metal into a much darker, more aggressive, and far more grandiose territory. Their work in the early 2000s, particularly the albums Puritanical Euphoric Misanthropia and Death Cult Armageddon, were truly breakthrough moments. Puritanical, which came out in 2001, was a pivotal moment because their first album to feature a real orchestra, the Gothenburg Symphony Orchestra. This was a groundbreaking step that created a sound that was both authentically orchestral and metal. To make those drums cut through the massive wall of sound, they relied heavily on triggered samples, and from what I hear, the rumor is that the kick drum sound on that record was a sample from Pantera's 5 Minutes Alone. This fusion of orchestra and metal created a new benchmark for the genre. They pushed this even further on 2003's Death Cult Armageddon, which used a full 46-piece orchestra. I mean, that's the kind of stuff they were doing back then. And thanks to the groundwork that they laid, combining an orchestra with extreme metal is far more common and well understood nowadays. But it wasn't all about brutality. Some bands used these new tools to paint with a more dynamic palette. Opeth's Blackwater Park, produced by Steven Wilson, showed how progressive death metal could be both crystal clear and crushing, seamlessly weaving savage riffs into delicate acoustic passages. It proved that the digital studio could capture depth and subtlety as well as heaviness. That vision reached new heights on 2005's Ghost Reveries, which was produced and mixed by Jens Bogren. And Bogren's work there didn't just define Opeth's evolution, it helped cement him as one of Europe's most important modern metal producers, later shaping records for Amon Amarth, Catatonia, and many more. Meanwhile, Meshuggah were pushing boundaries in different ways. Their precision and polyrhythms laid the foundation for what became later known as djent. But their songwriting was only half of the story. Their embrace of digital technology was pivotal, and they helped popularize tools that would define the next decade of metal. On 2005's Catch 33, they controversially used programmed drums exclusively, utilizing Toontrack's drum kit from Hell software to achieve an inhumanly precise and mechanical sound that was central to their vision. This was a key moment in the drum programming revolution. Then, for 2008's landmark album Obscene, they helped pioneer the use of amp modelers in a serious metal context, recording guitars with Line 6 units plugged directly into the recording desk to get a brutally sharp and consistent tone, inspiring an entire generation of bands to follow in their footsteps. And this next one is a perfect example of the democratization I was talking about earlier. Out in France, Gojira self-produced their breakthrough From Mars to Sirius in their own studio. That kind of autonomy was almost unheard of before the 2000s, and it gave them the freedom to craft one of the most unique and recognizable metal albums of the century. The production wasn't standard at all. It had its own distinct fingerprint, instantly recognizable as Gojira, and musically, it revolutionized the use of guitar techniques like harmonic rakes, pick scrapes, and other percussive tricks that became a defining part of their sound and a major influence on modern metal. What made this all possible was this new DIY ethos. Bands no longer needed $1 million label budget or a famous producer looking over their shoulders. With the tools of the digital era, they could take full control, experiment, and shape their own sonic identity. From Mars to Sirius is one of the best examples of what happens when total independence meets raw creativity, and that's a record that could have only been made in the 2000s. Of course, behind all of those records were the producers and the mixers, the guys we were constantly trying to dissect and emulate. In the UK, two names stood out: Colin Richardson and Andy Sneap. Richardson, who started earlier, helped define modern metal with landmark albums for Carcass, Fear Factory, Machine Head, Chimera, and Bullet for My Valentine. His meticulous mixes, especially the massive snare sounds on records like The Impossibility of Reason and The Poison, set the standard for clarity and impact in the 2000s. I mean, Colin was considered the best. Some of the drum samples that he crafted during that era are still in circulation today. They're still relevant decades later. Sneap, who was once Richardson's assistant and later his contemporary, became one of the decade's most in-demand producers. He's a guitarist. I mean, he now plays in Judas Priest, but people loved him because he brought a guitar player's perspective to the studio, and he shaped game-changing albums by Killswitch, Trivium, Arch Enemy, Testament, and many more. His guitar tones became legendary, and just like his guitars, his drum sound was instantly recognizable. The tight, punchy, sample-reinforced Sneap snare became a benchmark in modern metal production, and it was endlessly copied and still talked about today. Along with his precise editing, layer, and dynamic control, it helped define the polished, hyper-tight sound of the 2000s metal. In Europe, Fredrik Nordstrom, who is often called the godfather of the Gothenburg sound, helped define melodic death metal with bands like In Flames and At the Gates. Also, he's the man behind Puritanical Euphoric Misanthropia and Death Cult Armageddon. He was a another giant. His productions at Studio Fredman laid the melodic blueprint that directly inspired the rise of American metalcore. Daniel Bergstrand was equally pivotal. From Destroy Erase Improved to Nothing and Beyond, he helped Meshuggah craft their signature otherworldly heaviness. His work also extended to Soilwork, Behemoth, and Strapping Young Lad, and it solidified him as one of the most forward-thinking metal producers of the era. And then there's Tui Madsen of Denmark's Anfarm Studio. He became the go-to for a powerful modern sound on records by The Haunted, Heaven Shall Burn, and many, many more. He actually popularized the trick of recording drums inside of an empty swimming pool. And in America, a new type of producer emerged, the digital native. A guy I know well because he co-founded URM Academy with me, Joey Sturgis. Joey started in his friend's garage with barely any gear. He was totally self-taught and proved that you could make massive sounding records entirely in the box in an untreated room. And while others were still clinging to expensive analog studios, Joey was pioneering new ways to mix and produce, and he was getting results that were on par with famous producers. His breakout work on albums like The Devil Wears Prada's Plagues and Asking Alexandria Stand Up and Scream defined the sound of a generation. This influence was fucking massive and helped spawn a generation of producers who realized that you could get a polished, powerful, and modern sound without needing $1 million studio. So no, I don't think that the 2000s was the peak, but I do think it was the most important decade because it was a fire that we had to walk through. We learned critical lessons. For instance, the backlash against Death Magnetic did not kill the loudness wars, but it made them impossible to ignore. It pushed streaming services to adopt loudness normalization, and it forced mixers and mastering engineers to rethink their approach. Instead of just crushing everything with brick wall limiters, the focus shifted to techniques that could make mixes both loud and clean. Things like smarter low-end management, controlled clipping of converters, transient shaping, and multiband dynamics. Those methods became the foundation for how we achieve competitive loudness today without completely destroying the dynamics. And how about those early amp sims? Well, they paved the way for the incredible tech that we have today. And I don't just mean Kemper, Axe FX, and the world of IRs, but also Neural DSP's plugins, Quad Cortex, STL Tones, Neural Amp Modeler, Tunos Genome, and a whole ecosystem of digital tools that deliver tones we couldn't have even imagined back in the 2000s. And these aren't just good enough for demos anymore. They're being used on major records and on world tours. What started as a stopgap has become a legitimate first choice for some of the biggest artists in metal. And the techniques pioneered by those architects became the blueprints for everything that followed. The precision editing of the 2000s was the precursor for the hyper-technicality of the gent movement. It was messy, it was loud, and it was frequently flawed, but it forged the tools and techniques that we use today. So while it was not the best sounding era, it was arguably the most important in shaping the sound of metal in the 21st century. But what do you think? Am I totally wrong? Was the 2000s the golden age for metal production? Let me know your favorite and least favorite sounding records from that decade in the comments. As always, like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.